These days, whenever Donald Trump boasts of solving 8 wars in 8 months, the U.S. president always adds a sigh of regret. He then repeats that he thought Ukraine and Russia would be the easiest one to solve. He's done it again since Monday's signing in Egypt of that plan to end the war in Gaza. So if rolling out the red carpet in Alaska for Vladimir Putin didn't work, what will? More pressure on Russia, say Kremlin critics. Pressure which goes nicely with the interests of U.S. arms manufacturers, what with NATO allies like Germany pledging to purchase U.S.-made military hardware for Ukraine. We'll ask about those Tomahawk long-range missiles that are top of Volodymyr Zelensky's wish list when he returns Friday to the White House. The welcome, a far cry from that Oval Office dumpster fire of a meeting back in February. With Trump used to rating his counterparts as either winners or losers, could his calculus be shifting? What with Ukraine resisting Russia's summer onslaught and hurting Moscow's pocketbook with successful long-range drone strikes against oil installations deep inside enemy territory. We'll ask about momentum and prospects for what's already been a very, very long war. Today in the France 24 debate, what happens if the Tomahawks are coming? With us from Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, near the front lines, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening.
From Berlin, he chairs the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Alexander Mereshko of President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
From London, Bill Browder, CEO of Hermitage Capital, author of Red Notice, his bestseller of how he found himself in Vladimir Putin's crosshairs. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
And it's good to see Anastasia Shaputskina, president of the Eastern Circle's think tank, professor of geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Thank you.
By the way, you can always listen to the show, that's right, listen, wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, Donald Trump, very much on message Wednesday when he spoke from the White House.
Middle East was 3,000 years, and we got it done. This is 3 years, and I think we'll get it done. I think that President Putin, I think he wants to get it done. We'll see. There's a great animosity between him and Zelensky. You probably have noticed, right? And I think it's hurting the process.
He thinks it's hurting the process. Donald Trump always equivocating, even when he's a little bit angry with Vladimir Putin. And by the way, we have breaking news. I'll begin with you, Alexander Mereshko, because Trump's been on the phone with Vladimir Putin this Thursday. He says President Putin and I will meet after high-level meetings in an agreed-upon location, Budapest, Hungary. Your reaction?
Well, I would say that there is no surprise for me. Unfortunately, Hungary right now is Russia's ally because of the policy of Hungarian leader, Mr. Orban. But, you know, the thing is that we already had some kind of summit in Alaska. It didn't produce any tangible result. And, you know, I don't believe that this new summit will also change the whole situation. I'm very skeptical about this. We don't need such summits because they legitimize Putin, who is war criminal. We need actions. We need President Trump to finally deliver on his promises previously made with regard to serious or severe consequences with regard to Russia and Russia's allies.
Bill Browder, they were on the phone for more than 2 hours, the U.S. and Russian presidents. Is that good news or bad news?
Up until the moment that President Trump decides to provide, crippling sanctions against Russia or devastating weapons for Ukraine, everything else is just talk. And of course, another meeting with Putin where they roll out some red carpets or whatever doesn't solve anything. And so I think that it's, at the end of the day, it all comes down to, is Trump ready to put enough pressure on Vladimir Putin so Vladimir Putin feels as if he has to negotiate? Because right now, Vladimir Putin doesn't feel like he has to negotiate.
But is that pressure coming. We're going to talk about oil in a moment, but first there's also the Tomahawks that will be on the topic of discussion Friday when the Ukrainian president visits the White House. Reports this week in the press that the Trump administration has been helping the Ukrainians with intelligence when it comes to their long-range drone strikes against oil installations inside of Russia. Let me put the question to you, Anastasia Shapachkina. Your thoughts, because the whole build-up to this week has been that Trump's starting to get annoyed. Now we have this announcement of a summit.
Yes, I think that Trump must have been a rather disappointing partner for the Kremlin. And we have gone all the way from the jubilant Kremlin mood after the meeting in Alaska to a rather souring mood, let's say, despite all of the positive signals that the Trump presidency has been sending. Just like Bill Browder noted on sanctions, right? Not only we have not seen an increase of sanctions, we have also seen the signs from Washington that the sanctions are being relieved, either on the organizations which have been taken off the sanctions list, or on the people which have been taken off the sanctions list, and also on the level of the unwillingness of Washington to follow new European sanctions and to back up Europe in that. However, the jubilation must have been premature, because after the initial fallout with Zelensky personally in the White House, after that humiliating scene we've observed early in the year, Trump has come a long way, and in a large part thanks to the European group diplomacy, right, led by several European countries, several visits to Washington in different compositions, including with Zelensky, and have patched that relationship and convinced Trump that it is to America's benefit to sell American weapons to Europeans in order for them to be used in Ukraine. And Tomahawks is just yet another chapter of a long list of American weapons which have already been delivered to Ukraine, and and every step is portrayed by Russia as something absolutely new, another red line to cross, and something a red line behind which only nuclear Armageddon can stop.
Can he sit down with Vladimir Putin and sell Tomahawks?
Absolutely. That's precisely the signature diplomacy, the deal of Donald Trump. Yes, he can, and that's exactly what he's doing.
Gulliver Craig, again, this is breaking news, but how do you think the citizens of Kharkiv will digest this on the eve of Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to the White House? Donald Trump announcing that there will be first high-level meetings and then a summit hosted by Hungary.
Well, I think I can only speculate, of course. I haven't had time to speak to anybody about it, but generally, Ukrainians are not very happy any time that Donald Trump makes overtures to Vladimir Putin and gives him a platform on the world stage. They're also not at all happy, of course, with their neighbor Hungary's behavior and being willing to host this summit. But I suppose the learning has been over the past few months that Donald Trump listens most to the person he last spoke to. And so Volodymyr Zelensky has got his chance tomorrow, after this long conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, to put his case. And the feeling in Ukraine, I think, is that Volodymyr Zelensky has got the wind in his sails in terms of his relations with Donald Trump. He seems to have been quite successful in convincing the US president that actually he's the strong one, and that Vladimir Putin looks rather ridiculous, having failed in almost all of his ambitions to overcome his much smaller neighbor in a short space of time. They still haven't even managed to take the whole of the eastern Donbass region.
Yeah, Anastasia talking about that pressure, that quiet pressure from European leaders. And among those European leaders that were present in Egypt on Monday for that signing of Trump's Gaza plan, the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who out loud said he hoped to gently nudge the US president onto the topic of Ukraine.
If we say all this today, it is also with the hope that the US president brings to bear the same influence on Russia's government to end the war in Ukraine as he did on the players in the Middle East to secure an end to the fighting in Gaza.
Alexander Mereshko, flattery will get you everywhere when it comes to Donald Trump, and show up when he does a signing of and claims it's a peace deal, even if the details are fuzzy, flatter him, and that's how you'll get what you want?
Well, we're trying to be very careful with President Trump to take into consideration sort of his specific traits of his character. And we're trying to be respectful because, after all, we don't have other president of the United States. We have to deal with the person who is currently the president of the US. And we're trying to be honest with our partner, with our ally, and our friend. We still continue to believe that the United States as a whole, as a country, is pro-Ukrainian. So, and we are very constructive when it comes to communication with President Trump.
You had nominated Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize and then withdrew that afterwards. Would you nominate him again if that's what it takes?
Well, it was a nomination for the previous year, and now the situation has changed. First of all, we observe that the rhetoric of President Trump has dramatically changed in favor of Ukraine. He started to understand the importance of Ukraine, its security, importance for European and global security. And of course, if he delivers on his promises, and not only me, lots of members of Ukrainian parliament and President Zelensky himself, he said openly about this, that Ukrainians will be honored to nominate him. But first, he needs to deliver on his promise. He needs to stop Russian aggression.
Bill Browder, you agree with that?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, so if Trump can end the war in Ukraine, of course, he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. But I think that this is all fantasy. And at the moment, the situation we have is that Vladimir Putin does not want to stop his war in Ukraine. He just doesn't. And the reason he doesn't is that he is basically in power because of this war. This is a war of distraction so that the Russian people don't get angry with him. They get angry with a foreign enemy. And so Putin doesn't want to end this war. And every time there is something that puts him in danger of Trump doing some kind of radical action, that they agree to another meeting. They agree to some kind of conversation. And my prediction is that when Trump and Putin meet in Budapest, nothing will come of it. It will be another one of these nothing burger meetings, using Trump's term.
But something happens in
we'll
between. Something happens in between, Bill Browder, which is Friday's meeting with Vladimir Zelensky. What if Donald Trump approves the Tomahawks?
I would be very. I would find it very surprising if between meeting Zelensky and meeting Putin, Trump would do that, because Trump has shown every time that he would say, I don't want to, we have an opportunity for peace. We're going to have a peace negotiation with Vladimir Putin. I don't want to mess that up. I don't want to, before he said, I don't want to mess that up with sanctions. This time I would predict that he'll say, we don't want to mess that up with Tomahawks. And perhaps he'll then say, we'll see how it goes in that meeting. And if it doesn't go well, we'll provide the Tomahawks. And if you remember, I think Trump had made 8 ultimatums of Putin to cease fire, ultimatums with sanctions and other types of consequences. And each one of the ultimatums passed, and there was nothing. Trump didn't do anything. And so I don't think that we should be sitting here, celebrating and thinking, oh, the Tomahawks are coming. Trump is finally getting tough, because he's not shown himself to be tough with 8 other ultimatums. Why would he be tough on the 9th one?
The Tomahawks have been discussed a lot of late. The range can go as far as 2,500 kilometers. Cost, by the way, $1.7 million per missile. Here you see a graph put forward by the Institute for the Study of War, and you see the lines showing as how far, compared to HIMARS, they can go. Anastasia Shapachkina, these Tomahawks, again, your prediction is different from that of Bill Browder. You're saying there can be both, a meeting in Budapest and the sale of Tomahawks. What would Tomahawks change?
I think that what they would change, of course, is that they would increase Ukraine's capacity for long-range strikes inside Russia. Today, this capacity has already been increased. And I want to just put all of this discussion about the delivery of this yet another weapon in perspective of two things. First, in a time perspective.
Yeah, because we had HIMARS, then we had ATACMS, and now we have...
Then we had also Leopards, we had the German tanks, we had then the different systems which allow to
and each time it's no and then yes.
Exactly. Each time it's a red line for Russia. Each time it's a no for the Western partners. And then it's a yes for Western partners, and it's no longer a red line for Russia. This is just a war as it goes. But I want to put this, what the discussion into perspective. First is the time perspective. It doesn't really matter if Trump sells these missiles and eventually they get to Ukraine, before he meets Putin or after, even if he does it in a few months from now. The important thing for Ukraine, I think, remains that the US hasn't just walked out. It hasn't completely dropped its participation in supporting Ukraine, even through the sale of weapons, these weapons or other weapons. Even the intelligence sharing, which was mentioned just right now, is of extraordinary importance. And that is even much more important than a sale of one or another weapon by the US. Because we have to also remember, that's another thing I want to put in perspective, of Ukraine's own domestic capacity to incur those long-range strikes. A lot of them were done with drones, and that capacity Ukraine has truly increased over the last year. But also in the last year, Ukraine has increased its capacity to produce domestic missiles, including longer range missiles. They are not yet produced at scale. They are not obviously anywhere near matching the Russian capacity to source itself either from North Korea or from other places, or for domestic production of Russian capacity of producing, for example, Shahed drones, which are very annoying to Ukraine. However, Ukraine has been able to increase, basically put about 1/5 of Russian oil refining capacity completely off the charts and inaccessible now to the Russian economy. And we are hearing reports that up to 40% of Russian oil refining capacity may be stricken by Ukrainian long-range strikes, 20% of which is off the limits. And that means, of course, if we think about that, first of all, that's touching the bloodline of the Russian economy, but also it's touching the high end of that bloodline, because you can export crude oil, and that's the low end of what you can export, of the spectrum of products. Refined products are on the higher end, so Russia gets more money for exporting them. And today, not only Russia stopped its exports of refined petroleum products, but it has started importing them because of the deficit of the dearth of refined petroleum products that Ukraine has created in Russia. So it is Ukraine, its own capacity to arm itself has increased from the beginning of the war to just 10% of its production capacity to 50% of its needs today. So that's something that we must remember also when we're talking about this or that weapon yet supplied by an ally.
As if basically there's two wars. There's what's happening long range and short range. Ukraine's drone warfare successes aside, by the way, in Ukraine, still the nightly dose of incoming fire. We've had fighting in recent days, forcing an order. You can see these images of children being evacuated from the town of Kostiantynivka, that's that's in the eastern Donbass region. Attacks on the grid that have been causing major power outages across Ukraine this week. Still more than 80,000 without power earlier in the day in the southern region of Kherson. Gulliver Cragg, in Kharkiv, this distinction between long range and short range, you feel it?
First of all, to put things in perspective, I think that Russian refined petroleum exports are a much smaller proportion of Russia's exports than crude exports. But that's not to take away from how impressive the Ukrainian strikes on these Russian oil installations have been. And the Americans have gone from being worried about escalation to being quite openly impressed by it. The Russians are responding in kind. Kharkiv region saw its gas production facilities struck overnight. And in the early hours of this morning, the attack was still going on when I arrived here this morning. So the Ukrainian economy is suffering too. But yes, it's very important to draw the distinction between these long-range strikes and the battle on the front lines, which is also increasingly dominated by drones, which means that soldiers there actually, a lot of them say it's not really right to talk about a line anymore. It's more a kind of kill zone, which is about 30 kilometers wide, where there are drones flying around everywhere, making one of the hardest things for soldiers to do is actually getting to their positions, to their dugouts. That's the most dangerous place when you're on the road between a town and the frontline position. A couple of days ago, I was in Donbass and I spoke to a very young bomber drone pilot who was talking about those dangers and why the drones are now being used more and more, not just for attacking, but also for delivering supplies to the guys who are in the trenches right on the front lines. His name is Tumba, that's his call sign, and he's only 23 years old.
Enemy FPV drones are constantly surveying the roads and trying to cut off our logistics so no one can drive to and from positions and relieve the troops or bring supplies. Our main task is still bombing and destroying the enemy who represent a danger to our infantry. But in second place, for sure, it's delivering supplies. You wrap them up in a protective bundle, strap that to the drone, fly up, and then at the delivery point you bring the drone down low enough so that the water isn't going to burst, or the food gets smashed up when you drop it. You release the bundle, and then fly off, and then the guys come out of their dugouts to pick it up and then send us a message to say thanks.
And you know, this difficulty in getting to and from frontline positions means that sometimes infantry soldiers have to stay there for weeks, if not months. It's absolutely hell there. And of course, the casualties on both sides are extremely high. Today I was in the cemetery in Kharkiv, and it's just indescribable how many new graves there are with the Ukrainian national flag fluttering over them. That means they're military graves.
Indeed. Alexander Mareshko, the feeling on morale, because as Gulliver was pointing out and showing, the Ukrainian soldiers, on the one hand, showing a lot of daring do. There is this feeling that the Russian gains have been much less than was predicted this summer. We're now heading towards the winter months, and yet, the toll continues to climb.
Yeah, we can see that Russian attempt at the offensive operation this summer has failed. And Putin and Russia has failed to occupy the whole territory of Donetsk region, Donetsk Oblast. So we can say that strategically Putin has lost. And territorial gains were not strategically important, and they were very modest. So we can talk about failure, total failure of Putin. Of course, this is the war of attrition. And this war of attrition, I mean full-scale invasion, because the war had started in 2014. But when we're talking about the full-scale invasion, it had entered its fourth year. It's extremely difficult to fight the war of attrition. But we have no other choice, because we are fighting for our life. We are fighting for our homes and families. If we stop fighting, we'll be eliminated as a nation, as a country. So no matter what, despite all odds, we are determined to continue our fight.
Yeah, and, you heard Anastasia Shapachkina describe the damage done to those Russian oil refineries. Last week, the Bloomberg News Agency estimated that Ukrainian missiles had damaged 1 in 3 refineries, with real-world consequences on the price at the pump for ordinary citizens in Russia, and for the export of less lucrative crude rather than refined oil products. But don't tell that to Vladimir Putin, who at an Energy Week conference earlier in the day in Moscow boasted that Russia remains a top oil producer, quote, despite the use of unfair competition mechanisms against us. Now, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air Advocacy group has pointed to 3 refineries in Turkey that made 1.8 billion euros selling oil to Western nations in the first half of the year. Bill Browder, you penned a piece, an opinion piece for the Financial Times this week. And in that piece, you wrote, how can the West sever this lifeline that Putin has more effectively? The answer lies in threatening the refineries that process the lion's share of Russian crude, largely concentrated in just 8 facilities across China, India, and Turkey. Threaten them. Can you explain?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. So if you look at this war, how can Putin carry on more than 3 years into this war? How does he afford all this equipment, all these men, everything? And the answer is very simple. It's from the sale of oil, the sale of crude oil. And what's interesting about the sale of crude oil is that there are 3 countries, there are refineries, oil refineries in 3 countries that buy most of the oil. As you mentioned, they're in China, India, and Turkey. And these 8 refineries, over the course since the war has started, have paid Putin $400 billion for his oil. And so the simple way to stop Putin from having the money to fight the war is to go to these refineries and not go to the countries, just go to the refineries. And when I say who should be doing this, it should be the United States, the EU, UK, et cetera. And they should say that you have a choice. You can either do business with the rest of the world, or you can do business with Russia. You can't do business with both. And if you choose Russia, go on.
Let me ask you on this, because we've heard Donald Trump loudly call out European nations for buying Russian liquefied natural gas. We saw him this week in the company of the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who he praises to the heavens and has never called out publicly, or very rarely when it comes to those imports of Russian crude that are then, as you say, transformed into refined products.
Yeah, well, I mean, in order to make this thing happen, the U.S. has to be on board, the European Union has to be on board, UK, Canada, Australia, Japan. And if all those countries were to say to these Turkish refineries, to the Indian refineries, and to the Chinese refineries, it's either us or Russia, but not both, then I think these refineries would say, okay, you know what? I don't want to be cut off from the rest of the world. I don't want to be able to, I want to be able to sell, to do business with, to buy products from, to use insurance from Western countries. I don't want to be isolated. I don't want, and whatever discount I'm getting from Russia is just not worth it. And if that were to happen, and I think it's very simple, it's very surgical and very targeted. If that were to happen, then what would happen to that oil? The oil would still be out there floating around somewhere, but it would be selling at $20 a barrel, not $60 a barrel. And if it was selling at $20 a barrel, in 6 months' time, Putin would run out of money. And if he runs out of money, then he comes to the table and then he says, okay, I'm ready to negotiate. Up until that moment, up until the moment that he's feeling weak financially and weak militarily, he's going to carry on thumping his chest. He's going to carry on running circles around Donald Trump. He's going to carry on doing all that kind of stuff. The only way to stop this war is to stop Putin. And the only way to stop Putin is to put real pressure on him. And the refineries are a crucial point of putting real financial pressure on him.
Alexander Mereshko, let me ask you, because Turkey's a neighbor of Ukraine. Is Turkey an ally of Vladimir Putin by purchasing, again, Russian crude and then selling it off?
Well, first of all, Turkey is our partner, even strategic partner, and Turkey is trying to help Ukraine. For example, what is important for us is that Turkey doesn't recognize attempts at annexation of Crimea and other territories of Ukraine. So it's truly important. But at the same time, we need to continue to work with Turkey to persuade them to stop buying Russian oil and gas, for a very simple reason, as Mr. Browder has just mentioned this, because those countries which buy Russian oil and gas, they provide lifeline to Russia. They help Russia to run war machine and help to continue war of aggression. Without these exports, Russia would not be able to wage a war against Ukraine. That's why we need to stop these countries, including China as the biggest buyer of Russian oil and gas, India and Turkey from buying Russian oil and gas. And by the way, the United States can take the lead, can be the leader in this process.
Just on this question, Anastasia Shapachkina, the Trump administration, which has been putting pressure on China and India when it comes to Russian crude of late, but I noticed in the statistics, they're also buying some of the refined products from those three Turkish refineries. So, why is what does Donald Trump want here, basically?
Yeah, from what I followed, only India got singled out as a buyer of Russian crude oil from all of the buyers, especially out of these three, by Donald Trump lately. And India's leadership had a perception it was not because of its buying of Russian crude, but rather for other reasons.
We had a bit of theatrics, by the way, today with Trump claiming that that Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, had agreed to stop buying it, and the Indian Foreign Ministry saying, well, we haven't said that.
I haven't heard that from Modi. So yes, and however, he hasn't yet singled out China or Turkey for that. But just to come back to this, is not only, obviously, Turkey is a good example of this strategic positioning between Russia and Ukraine for years, right? Since 2014, Turkey has positioned itself as a defense industry partner of Ukraine, in addition to being a big diplomatic ally and giving important political support to Ukraine on many instances. But at the same, it hasn't prevented Turkey from being a major Russian ally and strategic partner as well. Rosatom, a Russian nuclear company, is building 4 nuclear reactors in Turkey. Then Turkey is an important oil hub for Russia, but also it is a place where a lot of the sanctioned goods are transitioning to Russia from, right? Turkey, among other countries, and that is very unfortunate. However, in this kind of all of the description of the theater of hypocrisy, I want also to underline, of course, the role of the European Union, because in the end of the day, neither China nor India have increased themselves, or nor Turkey, the import of Russian oil dramatically. Russia doesn't dominate their energy mix today. What they do is they re-import. They serve as just a passage point, mainly, to then re-export the Russian energy toward the Russian oil toward Europe. And Europe remains, that's hence that report that you cited by Kreia, right? The hypocrisy of sanctions. Europe remains that ultimate importer, and at the same time, and as it's now being threatened physically by Russian drones on its territory, as Russian ships are cutting off the undersea cables,
and it's offering to pay for the Tomahawks,
and as it's offered to pay for the Tomahawks, as it's paying for other weapons, American weapons toward Ukraine, Europe at the same time is buying Russian oil, and that is, of course, the epitome of hypocrisy.
Can we pretend Brexit hasn't happened, Bill Browder, and add the UK to the list? Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, waiting till after his recent trip to India to announce sanctions against the Nayara refinery. That's in Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's home state of Gujarat, already sanctioned by the EU, a refinery partly owned by a Russian oil company, Lukoil. Your thoughts on, how do Europeans, and I include the UK in that, handle a country like India?
Well, I don't think it's a question of handling India. It's a question of handling the 4 Indian oil refineries that buy all the Russian crude oil. And it's very simple. We say to them, if you buy that oil, you can't do business with us. And is it really worth it to you, the oil refinery, to get some oil at a discount if you're going to cut off your opportunity to do business with the rest of the world? And I guarantee you, those 4 oil refineries would stop buying the Russian oil because they don't want to become an isolated business just doing business with Russia. That's not what they want. And the example that you just mentioned of sanctioning 1 oil refinery, well, there's 4 oil refineries in India that are buying all the oil. I don't know what the logic is of the UK only sanctioning 1 of them when there's 4. And so there's an absolute ton of inconsistency, hypocrisy, and stupidity in this whole sanctions policy. And it's very simple. If you look at who buys the Russian oil, there's 8 oil refineries. If you tell all of them, stop doing it, and we'll punish you if you do it, they'll stop doing it. And if they stop doing it, then Putin runs out of money. It's that simple.
Alexander Mereshko, can we say that the conclusion of all this for our viewers, to make it simple, is sanctions are messy, arms exports are easier?
Well, we need both. We need sanctions. We need sort of synergy of all different methods to stop Russian aggression. We need weaponry, sophisticated contemporary weaponry, long-range missiles like Tomahawks, and we need sanctions. And besides, President Trump, he promised many times to finally implement these sanctions against those countries which buy Russian oil and gas. So he should just keep his word, keep his promise.
Gulliver Cragg, a word then looking ahead to that White House meeting that will take place. Again, the one back in February is now water under the bridge. They've met again at the White House. They met last month on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. How strong a hand or how weak a hand does Volodymyr Zelensky have returning to Washington?
I think he thinks that he's got quite a strong hand. He's impressed the Americans with Ukraine's resilience, with these long-range strikes. Donald Trump is in a position where he wants results. He wants to show some progress on resolving this conflict. He's got the midterms coming up to think about. It might be something that could detract attention from the very unpopular policies that he seems absolutely hell-bent on pursuing inside the United States, to the extent that we can expect Donald Trump to act logically or in the interests of the United States. And I think that that is very doubtful considering his behavior. But if we want to assume that kind of logical behavior, there are quite a lot of reasons to assume that he will continue to try to take a more pro-Ukrainian stance and perhaps put that pressure on Putin that everybody agrees is the only way to make Putin change his position. Because as Bill Barrett was saying, unless there is much greater pressure on him, he sees no reason to stop this war. In fact, he sees every reason to continue it because he's afraid of losing power if he didn't.
Has he learned on the fly, Volodymyr Zelensky, Anastasia Shabachkina?
Oh, I think he learned not on the fly, but rather in the bunker, I would say, rather than on the fly. However, every day...
He's been president of Ukraine since 2019. We saw those images
I was just about
of
to say,
a younger Volodymyr Zelensky.
And younger Trump. Exactly. Every day Zelensky lives. He lives a day, yet a day longer than he thought he would back in February 2022, I think. And this is kind of to underlie the underlying weakness of Vladimir Putin today, is that we always talk about numbers, how it is limitless, the number of men and manpower, especially, that Russia has. And I want just to potentially just to sum up with this, the weakness today that Russia is exhibiting is actually to recruit more men voluntarily who would sign those contracts. It is a weakness which is at the same time human resources. Russia spent about 20-25-year annual budget, which it foresaw for paying those high sums of money, but recruited only 90,000 men at those contracts, which is basically about 3 months worth of meat fodder for Ukraine at the current rate. And at the same time, the need is massive to really throw more and more men at the front by Russia, and not being able to meet that need with money, and also running, higher and higher inflation, and experiencing the draining effect also on the Russian sovereign wealth fund through those payments. Russia has just changed the law to allow the recruitment of reservists. That potentially, the bad news is that that's potentially 2 million men. But the good news is that before that law was changed, those men were not reachable by recruitment. They could not have been forcefully sent to Ukraine. Well, now they are subject to also being sent to Ukraine. Those men are not willing. They are not signing up at their own free will. They don't want to be paid to be killed, and they will be sent to Ukraine as well. And second category falling under that law is the private military contractors who have, up until now been basically free to sign or not, but now they are going to be qualified also to be put under reserves. That would ease at the same time the financial burden in Russia, because they would not have to pay these men so much, but also it shows us, and it will also raise the temperature, social temperature, internally potentially for Vladimir Putin, because now he is also facing the human resources shortages, and the war for him is not as easy and as
But
limitless.
I'm sorry, Anastasia, we just heard, the President Trump offer Vladimir Putin another summit? He always divides the world into winners and losers. He doesn't think Vladimir Putin's a loser.
He doesn't think that yet, but neither he thinks Vladimir Zelensky is a loser either. And that's a big change because he had thought that. And that's already a win for Ukraine.
Alexander Mereshko, your thoughts on this Friday meeting, what needs to be achieved?
Well, I hope that President Trump and President Zelensky will come up with a plan how to bring Russia to the table of negotiations and how to make Putin negotiate in earnest. And the only way to do it is to put maximum pressure on Putin, because Putin, for him, any kind of ceasefire, any kind of peace presents mortal danger to his stay in power. And Putin understands. Putin will stop negotiating only on one condition: when his stay in power will be threatened. And to do that, we need to coordinate our efforts, Ukraine and the United States and Europe. And together we can achieve this result. But it takes efforts, and it takes, first of all, resolve.
Gulliver Cragg, your final thoughts on this?
I'd just like to underline that there is a risk here, I think. If Putin feels that he hasn't got enough men, that he's under more pressure and agrees to a ceasefire, but that is not a resolution of the conflict and is not Putin having given up on his ambitions regarding Ukraine, then there is a huge risk that he will either, while a ceasefire lasts, try to achieve his ambitions by other means, by meddling in Ukrainian politics. Ukraine will have to hold elections at some point, and there is ample scope there for destabilizing the country. For all his great successes on the international stage, Volodymyr Zelensky is being more and more criticized at home. There is a big destabilization risk there, and if that doesn't work, then he will be able to find a pretext for starting up the war again. So I think that Ukraine and all of its allies need to be very, very wary of what might happen if and when Vladimir Putin eventually agrees to a ceasefire.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Gulliver Cragg, so many thanks for joining us from the frontline city of Kharkiv. Alexander Mereshko in Berlin. Bill Browder in London. Anastasia Shapochkina, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.